All right. So I'm dedicating today to bones, not next week, but the week after, the 31st. That there will be we'll do our bones practical. I'll give you the logistics next week on how we're going to do that. So what I sent you effectively was a study guide for all of this, wherever it ended up being sent out. And here we are. So the study guide is effectively the handout. Here it is. So I teach this, like in the fall, I will teach this lab again, this formulation of the lab, which is more dedicated to nursing students, pre-health career majors, and things like that, versus the pre-medical students and bio majors, which we call advanced anatomy. So although I use the same study guide for both, you will not have as much detail, but you'll have a lot of the detail that's on this study guide. You'll be able to have this study guide, and I'll explain to you, you'll have some resources to use when you take this practical exam. And whether or not, as you'll see at the end, whether aspects or certain joints are on it, we'll see how much time we have. And I'll have a better determination of that next week, depending on how much we get through today. So this is a very useful reference and something you're going to probably want to write on the board or follow if I do write on the board or make some notes here on this particular. Let's continue on. Sometimes I think writing it this way is easier. Because my handwriting is awful. Nevertheless, okay, here we go. So I always start, this is something, if you're taking the lecture component of this, you'll get to, this is sort of the basic, sort of what bones are. And for the most part, all of our bones come from something called cartilage. So we have a lot of the cartilage left over. Like the fact that you can do this with your nose, that's cartilage. Okay, cartilage has an inherent amount of more flexibility. Your ear, cartilage. Okay, so there's inherently a little bit more give. So cartilage is, well, is what I would consider semi-solid. It's sort of not, it's sort of a cross between gel and solidity. And depending on what's inside of it, it's very interesting. And what's interesting about cartilage in general, cartilage does not have blood vessels in it. What turns most cartilage into bone is when it's invaded by blood vessels. So when you're developing in utero, when babies are developing inside their moms, that skeleton is there. It's relatively firm, but it's made out of cartilage. And it's and until the age of ultrasound, we couldn't tell. Really, we got some little hints of areas that began to, a fancy word is called ossify, meaning it start to turn to bone. And even as children, maybe up until age anywhere between 16 to maybe in men, sometimes as late as 21 or 22, our bones are continuing to grow and there's still cartilage in them. And even when they're done growing, there's cartilage at the end. What makes up a joint that moves, like your elbow, fingers, is the fact that there's cartilage at the end that's kind of a soft, smooth substance that can tolerate moving around it all the time. It doesn't have the rigidity of bone, so to speak. So most of the bones have a cartilage shell, and they're surrounded by connective tissue that's called perichondrium that sort of holds it and gives it shape. All of this changes when it becomes bone. Okay? And most of the blood supply and nourishment for cartilage comes from this connective tissue. And it's all different when it becomes bone, and that's the interesting thing about bone. So there's different kinds of cartilage that you'll look at, and we'll look at a little bit more in joints. For the most part, the cartilage that we're concerned about is this hyaline cartilage. When we start to get into joints, fibrocartilage, which makes up the very famous menisci or knee cartilage, that's torn so much in sport. And just recently you hear about it every day that somebody else has gone down with a torn cartilage that are there, and different things that are part of it. that has a lot more, designed to be a lot sturdier. And elastic, there's not a whole lot that we concern ourselves with in this class. But when it comes to hyaline cartilage, that's what bones basically come from, with some limited exceptions that are there. And the ends of them become the joints. Your ribs don't effectively, until you're very, very old, turn into bone. And then gradually that cartilage becomes more bony. And all the things in your trachea, that's all respiratory cartilage, your nose, the fact that it can move makes it cartilage. And these are useful diagrams. They're color coded. And effectively, what you are going to see when it comes to bone, when we're young, bone elongates its shapes. Once it stops growing, it just kind of gets wider. And it doesn't really elongate. So once you're done with, whenever you stop growing, and it varies for all of us. Okay. Most women are done 15, 16, maybe 18 at the latest. Most men by 21 or 20. Some men, like me, stop really growing from the elongation standpoint about ninth grade. That's the way it works. Okay. And others, I have two nephews, my sister's two boys who both grew in college a couple of 3 inches. Okay. Went from being like my height to being 6 feet. Go figure. I was always hoping to be tall. It just never worked. Okay. I have two male cousins on my dad's side that were both 6'3" or 6'4". Go figure. But nevertheless, and it just tells you what bone does, and it's got a lot of important roles. Again, that's more lecture material. This is our stuff. Everything to understand anatomy, it's all about sort of classifying it and organizing it. And when it comes, and this classification lends itself to muscles and it lends itself to nerves, which are the three main areas we look at in the lab. Okay, axial. The axial skeleton, your axis, is your core in exercise terms. Okay, your head, your neck, your ribs, your backbone. That's your long axis of your body. Skull, vertebral column, rib cage. That's it. The appendicular means appendages. Anything to do with your arms and legs, plus the connectors. By definition, the connectors, which we call girdles, okay, are the attachments. So your shoulder assembly and your hip assembly, technically, from a standpoint of anatomy, are involved with the appendicular skeleton. That has to do with your appendages. So you can see the way they've color coded that sort of brownish color versus the more yellowish color, with the cartilage being pretty much blue in color. You can see that the ribs and all the aspects of the vertebral column, all of that stuff is axial, and everything else is appendicular. We're also classify bones, and it has nothing to do with their size. It's about their shape. And really, when we study bones, probably the bone we study the most is the classic long bone. So, what's a long bone? It's the femur. By the way, it's the longest and strongest bone in the body. You take this, measure it, and multiply roughly by 4, you can probably get an idea of how tall it is. It's not hard to say. So what makes it? It's longer and it's wide, and we almost exclusively find it. So we look at this a lot, because this is really when you analyze bone, particularly from a lecture standpoint, understand how bones are made. Simple, just as simple as comes from this. When we talk about short bones, they're relatively small. So if you look at some of these, and I know it's chopped up, these little bones here that are in the ankle and foot assembly, they're short. They're sort of cubic shaped. They're a little bit different. Your kneecap's one of them. Okay, and there's a certain amount of variation. Sometimes we have an extra one that's happened. Bigger is So we mostly see in the classic spots when we look at them are in the wrist and the ankle. And then there's only two other shapes, flat. The classic flat bones, and they're really important because that's where most of our blood information occurs in adults. The sternum, white one here is your breastbone, that's a flat bone. Bones of the skull, for the most part, flat bones. Right there. And there's aspects of bones where we see aspects of flatness in the bones. We see the hip assembly is kind of like that. Here, I have one handy here. Okay. For instance, right. Like this is an aspect of the hip. It's flat for the iliac crest. Put your hands on your hips and touch the top of that. It's there. So those are irregulars. So flat bones, the ribs, shoulder assembly called the scapula, sternum, skull. And the irregular bones are all the bones that make up the hip, and it sort of defies description. So, for instance, this is a bone that's providing, kind of helping you to hold up your head. It's a vertebrae. Very odd shape. And so we use that for classification. They're giving you some illustrations of it. Again, a long bone here, that's the humerus. Here's the sternum. Come on in. Here's the talus that's down on the ankle. One of those ones that's part of the ankle assembly and part of the back of the foot or hind foot assembly, and an irregular bone that are there. And then they go into the structure. We're concerned about the gross structure. The gross structure means what it looks like, what we can see, what we can touch, what we can feel. Okay? Bone is very, and some of these bones, we got these bones when the school started to have a more elaborate science department. They bought like units of these bones, probably from some other school or place. So some of these, and you can see how beat up they are, this is an actual bone. How can you tell? You can see the hollow area in this kind of a flat bone tab. A lot of the marrow is located in the back of the shoulders, the shoulder blade area that are there. When they stain and put preservatives in, they kind of a regular color. But most of the bones that we utilize, because they're a lot more accurate and much less likely to be beaten up and destroyed, are made out of plastic. So you've got, that's the distinction, as you can see. But what they do have is you can make out a little bit on some of the actual real bones, like this, is you have a hard outer area called cortex. That's the strength of the bone. And you have an area on the inside which imparts a certain amount of flexibility, a certain amount of give, a certain amount of surface area where blood formation occurs, and that's called cancellous or spongy bone. And it's a combination of those two. And again, that's to deal with that more here, than I would anyway in lecture. So compact or cortical bone is dense, very smooth and solid, or spongy bone. And you can see it's got that honeycomb here. So if you look inside, like any of these ones, like I was showing you, you start to see that just appearances of that, as these have got sort of polarized over the years. The reason they don't, you can't feel bone, very good. So most schools deal with plastic bones, and like these have a certain amount of real bones. Been here forever, I have no idea how it is. And so that's kind of, and it's a good view to kind of look at it. There's the femur. This is what you're basically, your weight is born upon this head and neck area. Has a lot of spongy bone. And we really look at this pattern. If you look at x-rays, it's how we tell if bones are broken many times. It's changed a lot over the years. When I started my medical career, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have today with regard to MRI and CT scanning capabilities. It didn't exist. We had x-rays, and x-rays we had some dye to, and things like that. Maybe some special x-rays on angles and things like that. That's all changed in the computer age. So we had to see things, we had to look closely at these patterns inside to learn about them. So I started looking at these, no joke, 50 years ago. I matriculated in medical school in 1973, 50 years ago, September, August. Oh boy, I'm old. I got to sit back. All right. So, and that's really you can see a lot of the honeycomb that's there. And then to me, the rest of this is all lecture stuff, so we're not doing. We want to focus on today naming the bones and naming the important parts of the bone for you to remember. Okay. And so that classifies as bone markings. Okay. And we use them all the time. Where muscles, ligaments, and tendons attach. So all of those exert a pull and a tug. And when it exerts a pull and a tug, bone forms as to the forces that are on it. If you put pressure on a part of the bone, it starts to kind of create like a little indentation. If you tug and pull on a bone, it starts to kind of grow out around it. And so we look at these markings over time. So if you looked at the bones of an infant or of a fetus, where the fetus had not been delivered alive and they looked at the bones, they would not have a lot of markings associated with them because there's not been a whole lot of pressure, as opposed to an elderly person where you would see a lot of things that are there. And so you're going to see all of that. So we classify them as projections where things are tugging on them. Okay, surfaces, generally an area where bones come together, forming a joint, which is by definition where bones come together, and openings or depressions. That's where things either sit on them or literally go through them. So all of those are important for our purposes because really what the test is when we do this practical, effectively for most of the questions are, I'll have a bone sitting out there. What bone is it? And identify this feature or that feature. So it's generally what bone is it and what are the two features. But you'll have some help doing that. You'll have a word bank. You'll have some other resources, so you'll be able to do fairly well with that, I would think. I just have to set it up, and that's what I'll do in 2 weeks when we come back together. So this is just sort of a laundry list, and I'll try to show you some examples. So they all have different names, and the names are kind of interesting. So you have different names for different areas of bone. So for instance, bigger projections over things attached. So for instance, here's your knee, okay, or the patella. Here is a rough area known as the tibial tuberosum. Bone is the tibia. This is where patellar tendon, which causes your knee jerk response, attaches and pulls on it and creates a rather prominent bone. Okay. A crest is that ridge shape. So when I took out before and showed you the hip, okay, don't worry about rights and lefts, I don't do that. Okay, I can tell you which one is which. So I know that that's going to be a left hip because I kind of have some information that I know the ischial tuberosity, another ground here is kind of interesting. And I know the socket is on the outside all the time. I know this is the back. It's got to be this way, not that. Okay, that's the iliac crest. So put your hands on your hips, you can feel it. Okay, so it's narrow, it's fairly prominent. Trochanters, very limited. We don't have them. Trochanters are huge. Okay, so there's only two. This is called the greater and this is called the lesser, which is their position. And these are major muscles that help to move your leg up and down. And the fact that you can lift yourself up, that's all because of these trochanters when you climb them on the femur. So greater and lesser trochanters. And sometimes we'll see a line, which is very narrow, not as distinctive as a crest. So you're between them. Not quite as distinctive, but clearly it's a line called the intertrochanteric line. So you might be thinking, this is much names. In medicine, for instance, one of the most common fractures when people get older is a hip fracture. Hip fracture occurs here in the head and neck. If it occurs in the neck, it's called a transcervical fracture across the neck. That has a lot of, the fancy term is morbidity. Meaning when that is an elderly person, it's very difficult for them to recover and walk. Inevitably, because the blood supply is interrupted, you have to remove the head and the neck at the very least and probably replace them. You did that all the time when I was a resident. Okay. It's not, the person's not at risk of dying. If someone's at risk of dying, we call it mortality. An intertrochanteric fracture here. The reason this one doesn't bleed excessively is there's a big thing we're going to learn about in joints called the capsule that surrounds it. Doesn't let the blood come out. Here, it's outside of the capsule. If this breaks, an older person could bleed out and die, or they couldn't. Both of those are immediate surgical. You don't really have an option. So even somebody, I can't even tell you how many people back nearly 50 years ago that were in their late 80s and 90s that we did these procedures to, because they wouldn't have survived or functioned at all without it. So I mean, that's why we utilize these names. They tell us that. A tubercle. Well, a tuberosity is a big bump. A tubercle is a little bump. There's lots and lots of different tubercles, as you can see. See if they have spines, cracks, stuff. Back on the hip, there's this little bumpy thing that's over here on the inside. That's called the adductor or adductor tubercle, because there's a muscle that attaches there, and there's a little tunnel. It's right next to it. You can almost make out the blood. And condyles, when they talk about an condyle is a smooth area with cartilage on it that forms a joint. An epicondyle is on the outside, it's a little bump. And these are big ones. They are where ligaments. So when we look at, for instance, famous structures. So when we look at something like this, here's a bad artist. That's more or less the name. So here, these are femoral condyles, these are tibial condyles. There's an epicondyle here, an epicondyle here. Okay, but what goes from epicondyle to epicondyle here and here are ligaments. These are very famously called collateral ligaments. So you have a medial collateral and a lateral collateral ligament. So if you're like me and a sports nut, okay, you hear about them all the time. You know, they have ligament damage. What ligament is it? It's a cruciate ligament, which is much more difficult to deal with versus a collateral ligament. Yeah, it's cartilage, okay, and you just go accordingly. So it's this particular lab, there's a lot more about that with regard to sport than a lot of other things. So the epicondyles are above the area, but they help to secure ligaments that stabilize joints. Spines on the edge, typically we almost see a spinous process. That's where the name spine comes from. Okay, as being the projection or protruding from the back of a vertebrae. And any bony prominence has a generic name of process. So when we're looking at joints, it's a little bit different. Okay, I told you about condyles, cartilage covered surfaces. Sometimes they're very distinctive in shape, and the facets are tiny. So on, for instance, a little vertebrae like this, you'll have little areas that are facets. These can be condyles, and sometimes you'll have tiny little aspects where there's additional cartilage. Facet. That's how you pronounce it, facet. And everything else are about where stuff passes through it. So you can have, for instance, look inside the skull, you see all sorts, and most of these are in the skull, but we'll see all sorts of indentations. So, for instance, these areas where the brain sits are called fossa. So they're rounded, kind of like sculpted out by pressure from the brain. Sometimes they're called fissures. A fissure is a slit. The most famous fissure is here in the eye. Where's my things? I have things going up. For instance, you see this sort of triangular shape, kind of wide open, that's a fissure. Okay? That's called the superior, which is on top, orbital, which is the orbit is the eye, socket, fissure, as you can see there, and they're pointing, and there's one below it, called the inferior orbital fissure. It's considerably less important. This is something that's called an artifact, the one on the bottom. Meaning, there's nothing in there. I know, you're seeing a big hole. That hole is filled with cartilage. It really doesn't do a whole lot. But when they make bones into skeleton to study, or we discover a skeleton, let's say in a body that was buried early on as a skeleton, that cartilage kind of deteriorates and melts away. And you have that hole. So it's called artifacts, or it's a hole in this big hole. There's another one over here. This is these little rounded openings are called foramina. Singular is foramen. This is foramen ovale because it's oval. Okay. This one in front is foramen rotundum because it's round. This is foramen spinosum because it's like a spine, like a pink one. And this is like a gash, so we call it foramen lacerum. It's another one of those filled with cartilage. Nothing goes through there. This important stuff goes through the other one. Part of the advanced anatomy is not only to know the holes, but to know what goes through. So the only one that you really, there's a couple of things you'll need to know. Surely the most important is this big one. That's the biggest foramen of them all, and it's named the flexor. It's called foramen magnum. Huge. What goes through that? Basically the brain stem, as soon as it goes through it, it becomes the spinal. So it's the largest of all the organs that are there. And you see other stuff that are there. For instance, when we look for the ear canal area, this little tunnel is often called a meatus. So it generally has an opening on one side, and like any good tunnel, an opening on the other side. So you have external meatus and the internal meatus. And we call them acoustic or auditory meatus. And a sinus is an area. Bones have little openings filled with air or fluid, either in them or where they come together. And that's another thing for a sinus. And those are the kinds of things that we see. Notches. Again, we go back to that famous notch here. Natural opening. That's such a big notch. This little one here is for the sciatic nerve. So this is called the greater sciatic notch. This is the lesser. So it's not as complex as all of that. It's all about the level of degree. For your level, I'm going to make it relatively easy for you just to be prepared to identify. For my advanced anatomy students, they have to memorize a fair amount. In medical school, we have to memorize everything we go through. So it's all about different levels of degree. I had a lot of students who would be here around in high school. They teach me, oh, we had that anatomy. Well, they had to basically being above or reaching the competency to do it. So as you go up the level, you learn more and more about it. So, and that's really everything from this particular PowerPoint. It's very much introductory, and the rest of it deals with bone physiology. PowerPoints 7A, 7B, and 7C They are the ones that are all about the actual bones themselves. It's truly the skeleton. And we deal, and again, the distinction is axial versus appendicular. So, again, axial and appendicular. So we start with the axial skeleton. There's approximately 206 bones. You don't have to remember the number. And most of them are paired anyway. So you have 100 on the right and 100 on the left for the most part. Not exactly, but pretty close to it. And so we divide the axial skeleton into the skull, which is the most complicated area. I do that first. The vertebral column, and there's a lot of vertebrae. Fortunately, some of them are fused. And the thoracic cage, which is mostly the ribs. Okay? And supporting the head and neck, protecting the brain and the spinal cord, the lungs, the heart, that's their job. And you can see it here in this sort of greenish color. Both front and back. So it's rather elaborate. And again, you can see in the yellow, that's where, even though the shoulder assembly, this bone called the scapula, obviously plays a role in protecting that area. It's by definition not considered part of it. Same with the hip assembly. So not only do we have an anatomical distinction for the axial skeleton, we look at the skull, we divide it into two areas. Okay? The cranial area, what's meant by a cranial bone, it means it surrounds the brain. And the other area is the facial bones. Okay, so you have cranial bones and you have facial bones. The facial bones basically construct the face, but they don't come into direct contact with the brain. That's the distinction. So cranial encloses the brain and the cranial cavity, lots of attachments for head and neck muscles for sure. Facial bones, framework of the face, a lot of openings, not so much internal openings, but openings to the outside. Your mouth, your nose, the orbit for the eye, air and food passages. Bones help to secure teeth, which are not considered part of anatomy in that sense. They fall into digestive anatomy. And yeah, they anchor a lot of what we call facial muscles if they basically have a lot to do with facial expression. Smiling, moving your lips, that type of a thing. Most of the bones are flat. Only one of them moves, the mandible, your lower jaw. Of the entire skull assembly, the only bone that moves is the mandible. That's what makes it unique. We'll get into the construction of the joints in a subsequent chapter, but the sutures are something that you see if we look at any skeleton. Here. Something oddball about this is what we do. It's like this. This is not the same one. Oh, sugar. So what you'll see, they outline in yellow on this particular model are these sort of like sawtooth bears, called the sutures. The old days before you have sewed wounds together, they called the stitches sutures, and when they healed, they had kind of a regular appearance. Not very cosmetic, just sew the skin together. So they get that name. And so part of identifying the markings on the skull are these sutures. Because they're very similar to something we talked about the last time we met, and those are the body parts. You have where these two bones come together, you have a suture that's very longitudinal, called the sagittal suture, sort of right there along the sagittal plane, if you remember that. Divides us right and left. This part of the body, you have a frontal plane, so suture from here to here is called the frontal suture, and we don't certainly call it the occipital suture, but in the back, we have a suture between the occipital bone and the parietal bones, and we'll get to all of those bones very shortly. And they are, and because it looks like an upside down Y, it resembles the formal Greek letter lambda, which is called the lambdoidal suture. And there is one more suture, sort of overlaps here, and again, I don't have the exact skull to meet it, called the squamous suture. It sort of aligns here with what we call the temporal, or the temporal bone. So we'll take a look at all of those in a second as well. So they're important. They have a lot of give to them until you're born, and then they tighten up. The only one, the one up at the top here, between the frontal and the sagittal suture, stays open. We give the name for these when they're open as fontanelles. So what that means is little fountains, soft spots. When a baby is born vaginally, a lot of times parents will go, "Oh my God, something wrong with the baby." Head looks all funny. To get to the birth canal, sometimes it shifts those. They go back into position. That flexibility really assists the birth process. It takes till about age 2 for this one to completely heal. And once in a while, you'll have to take a protection fluid pressure with no protrude. So that's what they got many little fountains and bottom walls. So it's very interesting. You see how this plays out in different things anatomically, like for that assisting the birth process. You'll see when we look at the construction of the hip, where that's the big distinction between men and women. Women's hip assembly is designed because of a wider hip when totally in the outlet for childhood. And it's interesting when we just find all we found in the woods, and somebody was hiking, digging, and they found a bone. What's a bone doing there? It makes you wonder if something, there's some criminal act occurred. Well, how would you know what bone it is? Well, you have to be able to tell us. We'll see, we'll go into this. The angle here on the hip, the angle on the pelvis, all play a role in identifying men and women. That's really the pivotal piece. You only have the skeletal remains. Because a lot of times you can't necessarily retrieve DNA, things like that. There's a lot of stuff that goes on. So there's the whole area of forensic science, which a lot of people find very interesting. I'm also addicted to crime shows. My wife always asks me, "How many detective shows are we going to watch?" But that's okay. Let me turn this off. All right. So here you can begin to see them. So this gives you an idea of what the bones are. You have here, you have all these different bones that are there. These bones that are on the side of the head is very, very large, the parietal bone. Here, going down, making the upper portion of the orbit, the frontal bone. And we'll look at these individually. This is called, and you can see they have the sutures identified, the coronal or frontal suture, that sagittal suture is over here between the parietal bone, and this is called the temporal bone, that really where that entryway into the ear is located. You have the squamous suture, and then here in the back you have that sort of upside down letter Y called the limb, which it doesn't really show you that well. And then here you can see all, and we'll get into each of these distinctly. So What I showed you before when we looked inside is called the cranial vault. Fancy name is calvaria. All those indentations were the fossa. Most of the front, superior, then in the middle or lateral, and the posterior as well. And so you can see all those fossa are in there. And that's where the brain sits, the so-called cranial cavity. This is what you looked at before. And so there's a lot that goes on with these different areas. It's just, and again, it's because the brain has developed and put pressure on the bones. It's created those indentations. You can see it here. You'll probably learn about it in lecture. If you're taking that at this time, where it's called Wolff's Law. And Dr. Wolff said that bone forms according to the pressures that are on it. And it's one of the truest ones of all time. So the openings are there, openings for the ears, the nose, eyeballs, lots and lots of different openings, lots of passageways. We'll get into it, all of these over time. And again, some of the different passages that are there that you can see from this. So now distinctly, you should know which are cranial and which are facial. The cranial bones, there's only 8, and you only have 6 names, because 2 of them are paired. You have a frontal bone, frontal is forehead. You have parietal bones up here, left and right, here. Occipital, one in the back. Temporal, one on right, one on left. Really think of your ear being embedded in pretty much in the middle of that, more or less. And then 2 that are most complicated for us to learn about, because we can't really see them. They're on the inside, the sphenoid and the ethmoid. Of those bones, 3 of them help to make up the orbit. There are 7 bones that make up the orbit. The frontal bone, the top of it, and deep inside, behind the eye and slightly above and behind the eye, are the sphenoid and ethmoid. The parietal, occipital, and temporal don't, the term we use is participate. They're not part of making up the orbit. And you'll see the picture. We don't have an independent frontal bone here. Kind of give you an idea roughly, but it kind of sticks up a little higher than that. It's really this. Above here, forehead, and over the eyes, and also this area. That upper part we call the supraorbital margin. This area, top of the eye. It's all frontal. So when we see in sport, somebody gets an orbital fracture, I commented on this last time we met. There's no, oh, it broke his orbital, and there's 7. That's just giving you a region. But you'll see that. So it's kind of a shell. There's different parts. I guess the most noteworthy is the rim where your eyebrows are. That's the supraorbital margin. That's about all you have to know. Yeah, I mean, again, the more advanced you go in anatomy, the more you learn about all these different terms that are there. So you can see it in this yellow color that's here. It's bigger than you think. It's very strong. So if you can think about, I mean, I don't know if you all are, did you have Dr. Buxton for physics? He and I are soccer crazy. He's Liverpool, I'm Manchester United. We're at war. So, well, I mean, if you think of those guys heading the ball, how they can generate so much power with their foreheads, not between the neck muscles and everything else. I'm amazed when you get a ball coming in, full blast, and how they can deal with it. Or when the heads come together, that's really, but tremendously strong, tremendously powerful. So So he's giving me a very hard time with Liverpool trying to chase down United for the Champions League. Very hard time. Good match today, Man City and Real Madrid for the. Oh, that's good. That was a great game. Nevertheless, moving on. So that's that bone that's there. Now, inside, this will get the sphenoid and ethmoid. This is the ethmoid. The sphenoid's very interesting. But I don't have a model of the ethmoid, but I do have one of the sphenoid that are there. So they're just showing you some of these. The parietal bones are very, very large. Between the two of them, they make up most of the top of your skull. There's no real anatomy. The most interesting thing anatomically is that the parietal bones are all part of the sutures. Every named suture, whether it's coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, or squamous, all involve parietal bone that are there. But there's not really a whole lot of anatomy associated with it. So you saw this before. That's one parietal bone. So you have one over here, and each of the sutures between the two parietal bones, you have the sagittal here between the parietal and both parietals and the frontal. You have coronal suture, parietal, and what's called the temporal bone, etc. In the back, you can see. Now, it's funny. In anatomy, the classic number is 206. You read any textbook, the body has approximately 206 bones. It's an approximate number because most of us have little bits of extra bone in different areas. I don't know that they all have a lot of function. These probably do not, but it's almost as though some of the areas, these are called sutural bones. It's as though some weakness developed and it formed what appears to be a separate, but even though they're all fused together. But anatomically, you can see where they were at one point not a complete bone, but at least had some degree of separation. We call those sutural bones. When we get to the kneecap or the patella, that's called a sesamoid bone. A lot of us have extras of those that form. There's not a lot to say about it other than that they're there. So there. Now, if you look back here in this brownish color, this is the occipital bone. The occipital bone has a lot of anatomy comparatively, more than the other two we talked about, and is very strong and has that enormous opening we call the foramen magnum. It also on the back, and you can feel it back here, has a series of ridges. That's because the muscles in the back of your neck are extraordinarily strong. Get back to the idea of heading a ball. What muscles they work on all the time is those. That's where they develop the speed, from those tremendous neck muscles, neck and shoulder muscles. That's where it comes from, the controls they have with those. And so you see a lot of ridges that are there. The nuchal line, there's a piece of soft tissue that helps to support muscles and ligaments in this area called the ligamentum nuchae, which we'll get to. And so they call this the superior nuchal line. And there's a bump right here in the back of your head. So it projects, that's called a protuberance. It projects outside, so it's external, and it's on the occipital bone, the external occipital protuberance. There it is. So I do have an occipital bone in my little collection of plastic. Like so. And so imagine and effectively, that's this. We took this skeleton, just like this. Here, protuberance, the bumps that are there, the opening here for the first. These are called occipital condyles. They sit on top of condyles on the first cervical vertebrae that allow your head to maintain that sort of nodding motion. You need to move a little bit to swivel side to side, which is shaping the joint. Okay? And has a big opening for the foramen magnum. And on either side, you have an opening here. Shoots out. That's called, and we'll get to it, it's called the hypoglossal canal. Hypoglossal means under your tongue. So the fact that we can stick out our tongue, that kind of stuff, the nerve that allows us to do that goes through that particular canal. So there's a, again, rather sturdy bone, larger than you think. You can see it under here, the same thing, except it's, you have a luxury ear. This comes from a plastic model that I was trying to order locally. They're very expensive. Oops. So again, you can see in that brownish color under here, and they show you this again. And this is looking at the interior. Again, you can see the thickness of it. The posterior wall, which means the back wall, joins together with and we'll get to the sphenoid bone. Like the parietal as part of all the sutures, the unique thing about the sphenoid bone when we get to it is it plays with all the other cranial bones. All the cranial bones interact with the sphenoid, they touch it. When we get to the face, or the upper jawbone called the maxilla, that's all the bones in the face make contact with that. So there's a couple of interesting little nuances. The foramen magnum, okay, occipital condyle sitting on the first vertebrae, the hypoglossal canal, and then these bumps or protuberances that you see. The next bone we look at is this one, okay? This is called the temporal bone. So the temporal area is the area around your ear and above it, sort of on the side of your head, but not the top side, like the parietal, the one that's sort of here, circling around the external ear. A much more complicated bone than you would think. If you look underneath it, okay, this orangish color, okay, has a lot of different components. You can see it's involved, these little openings here and here are part of it, okay? So you're going to see an opening that's created between the occipital bone in brown and in this lighter brown, the undersurface of the temporal bone. Has a fancy name, it's called the jugular foramen. The jugular vein is the vein that drains, that's the term we use, brings the blood back from your brain, going back towards your heart on either side. And a lot of other structures go through that. Veins generally have wide, kind of flat openings. Within the temporal bone itself, there's a more rounded opening. That's called the carotid canal. That's how the very famous carotid artery goes up into your head. Most of the time, arteries and veins have the same first name. So taking your pulse here is the radial artery. On either side of it, you have a radial vein. You have two. Okay. Femoral artery in your thigh, you have femoral veins. Okay. Typically, they're the same. Ulnar artery on this side, ulnar veins. There's a couple of places anatomically where they have different names. Most famously, in the head, you have carotid arteries going up, jugular veins going down, even though they're kind of mated to one another that are there. So that's an important anatomical structure, and they're very, very close. One, the carotid canal is within the occipital bone, and where the occipital, was within the temporal bone, and where the temporal and the occipital come together is the carotid, is the jugular foramen. There's also other structures I'll show you with it as we get moving. So here's the temporal bone. In classic anatomy, we look at 4 different regions. We're not going to do that. Okay? And I'll pull one of these out. We used to even have we actually have a nice bone model, but they're very fragile. So, again, this be the one on the left. And how do I know? Because this heavier portion is inside. And so you have the temporal bone itself. Behind your ear, this is a process. It's called the masculine process. Sort of like a resonating chamber for sound. Most famous, the opening. That's covered by the eardrum. That's the external auditory or external acoustic gates. On the inside, you have the main ear, the internal part. That's the tunnel. What's interesting is that the nerve that goes in there that allows you to hear is the only nerve coming from the brain that doesn't exit the body. It buries itself in here and allows you to hear it balance. It's called the vestibular cochlear nerve. So you have masculine process. This, because it looks like the tip of a pencil or a pen, is called, basically what you and I would use a stylus if we were having a marker on a computer. The same thing they used to use in ancient times where they make markings in stone and clay. With stylus. Do you remember record players? Discs of vinyl that spun around? You've seen the little. The thing is, when you went to the stereo store, you bought a stylus. It was the needle part that picked up the sounds of the grooves. One time. It's amazing today the sound that we can generate with like those home theater systems. I mean, people spend thousands and thousands of dollars with like speakers that you use for rock concert. That's right. My buddy and I, we hung out in Sirius for a week. We love that stuff. Now you get to. I get better sound with my earpods. This is awful. Oh. Technology. And so that's called the styloid process. It's a point, but you can't feel it. You can feel the masculine process, the styloid process over here, encased in muscle. So when it's pulled, and it looks like a point, but it's not supposed to be pulled. And this kind of part of your cheekbone. Okay, this is called the zygomatic process. We name bones and we name parts of bones. Some of the things that stick out of bones, looking for the piece that goes with it. You don't see it right away, but I'll show it to you on the skull. So here you have the skull. Here's the same side. Here's the zygomatic process. This is a zygomatic bone. So that process we named not from where it's coming from, but where it's going to. So zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This little piece here is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. It's going toward the temporal bone. Together, they form this, as you can feel, you and I very often call a cheekbone, the zygomatic arch. Okay? And what's important about it, anytime you have openings, important stuff goes through it. So the muscle, one of the muscles that allows us to chew, called the temporalis, goes right through. What it does, again, I don't have the ones that match, I have ones that are used to be able to see here. So this is the mandible, the only bone that moves. And what it does is you have a muscle that comes from up here to heel, like a chewing motion. It searches into that blue area and allows you to move. One of the muscles that allows you to move your jaw up and down. They're called muscles of mastication chewing. So they all have a purpose. They're there. So that's the stuff that's on here. Which leads us to two bones that are super important. This one's got all sorts of goodies coming from. This is the sphenoid bone. You see it here. So take a look. It sits right. Imagine this area, but it's all encased in bone. Okay. Here, it's like this from the undersurface. Look at it this way. Those little slits I showed you before, the superior orbital fissure, are right here in the sphenoid bone. Okay, and we'll go over the anatomy. So it looks like they call it a bat shape or a winged bone. You have lesser wings here, greater wings here. Where the wings come together, they form that opening. That's superior orbital fissure, where a lot of the nerves that help you move your eyes side to side, up and down, go through. The nerve that allows you to see goes through another opening in this bone here. Goes this way. It's called the optic canal, this opening, sort of the inside, the back of your eye. And you have another one on the other side that does the same thing, goes the other way. And the two of them, you can imagine, crisscross right over here. This very important area, there's a little saddle-shaped indentation called the sella turcica, also known as Turk's saddle. In that depression, anytime you see a bony depression or a hollow or something surrounded by bone, important stuff's in it. Orbit, your eye. Thoracic cage, your heart and lung. Here, pituitary. What crisscrosses above it, the optic chiasm, where the nerves that allow you to see come from your eyes, go towards your brain. And on top of that, the major blood supply to your brain called the cerebral pulse. That's a critical area anatomically. So when someone has, unfortunately, well, a common, relatively speaking, brain tumor, it's pituitary. It's benign. The trouble is, if you go to remove it, great risk of someone being blind or causing bleeding in the brain. It's a very delicate area surrounded by large. And also, it's got these openings, as I pointed out before. Here's the saddle. Then you have oval foramen rotundum, and these important nerve, and important blood vessels, foramen spinous. They're all there in this one bone. These, which you can see coming down, are surrounded by bone. Here you can see them in a regular skull. They're there. They're called pterygoid plates. They reminded anatomists of that ancient dinosaur that we used to call pterodactyl. Okay, now we call it pteranodon. My son's step family, we all joined him down in Disney. We went dinosaur cruising. We didn't go. Thank goodness. Too much water. So here, just to summarize, so the temporal bones, we'll look at not the things that are in there, but just a little bit to summarize the ones that are important. So the zygomatic arch, part of it that's there, that external acoustic meatus, that internal portion, the jugular foramen, carotid canal, the lacerum, which doesn't have anything going through it, the internal acoustic meatus. So one I forgot about. There's a teeny tiny opening. Super important. I forgot about. Okay. It's right here between the mastoid process and the styloid process. Called the stylomastoid foramen. The nerve that allows you to move your face muscles, smile, move your lips, purse your lips, blow, or help to assist you in eating. That's for the opening to the facial nerve. Here, somebody has temporomandibular joint dysfunction, a lot of times they have pain. That pushes right in that area. stylomastoid frame. And they're just again showing you the same thing over again. Here's the bone, same picture. A lot of these. Here's that sphenoid bone with all the openings. The sphenoid, very common. When they call it a keystone bone, it means all the other cranial bones attached to it some way, shape, or form. Sella turcica and the hypophyseal, that's a fancy name for the pituitary. The wings and the pterygoid processes, superior fissure, the canals, the rotundum, the ovale, and the spinosum. So they're all important structures. I have those all in the handout. And then lastly, the deepest bone. If you imagine the sphenoid is behind your eyeballs, way at the back. The ethmoid is even deeper above it. And it looks for all the world. I'll show you. Again, I don't have a model of it. It's important in the sense that it's kind of like this. All right? It's almost cross-shaped in that regard. It has, and there's a lot of thickness coming out of the base of the bone. This is called a perpendicular plate. This is perpendicular to this going across, which is called a cribriform. Okay? And the little openings in this are nerves. Called cribriform foramina. That's where the nerves help the skeleton. So you'll see in a second what it looks like. That uppermost portion I didn't label is called the crista galli. So the cross shape is where the crista come from. Galli, I'm not sure where that forms. The linings of the brain attached to it. So it's very, depending on the skeleton you look at, that shelf is pretty distinctive. So in the models, you can see they make it a little hump there. And some of these things, it's really quite a distinctive shelf. That's how ones you hear about where there's a martial arts blow that you can get killing blow where you can drive, your skull, basically the bone in your nose on the brain. It's not in your nose, so you have to that's the bone. That's my sum and total existent knowledge of martial arts blows. So you'll see it that are there. And so that's kind of, I did schematic. It's way deep inside, behind your nose. There's the perpendicular plate. That forms the upper half of what we call the nasal septum. The nose has a cartilage septum, and behind it, it has bone. So the bony portion, the upper portion is and you'll see this when you look at the face shortly, is the perpendicular plate. These masses give volume to the nose. And that's most of that. And then we'll do the facial bones and take a break. The facial bones, 14, nearly all paired. The only ones that aren't paired are the low. If you would reach in and feel the lower portion, there's a shelf of bone, like a little plow. It looks like a snow plow on its side. It's called the vomer. It's hard to see. And then the mandible. Now the mandible, the lower jaw, surely was two bones because it looks identical on the right and left. We call that symmetrical. Yeah, why we think it's one, why we call it one bone is that when you're born, the bone has fused together. So when bones that are fused together, even though there's a right and left side, when we are born, are considered one bone. All the others are paired. The upper jaw, the maxillary bones, one on each side. Zygomatic bones, the ones on the outside of your orbit, one on each side. Nasal bones, the upper part, the bridge of your nose, one on each side. Lacrimal bones, bones inside your orbit. You can feel that little bump inside the innermost or medial part of your orbit. That's called the lacrimal caruncle, which is that bump that's there. There's an opening, that's where the tear duct is. The palatine bones, they're sort of like in the back of your in your mouth, the bony part or hard palate. And then the conchae, which I don't even know why they consider it a separate bone, but they do. And it's just within your nasal cavity that gives it more volume. The mandible has the only one of these that moves and the only one that has anatomy. All the others is just learning the name of the bone. Mandible is this. What does it do? Basically fits in here. Okay. Only one that moves. The movement is here in the under area of the temporal bone. You have cartilage. You can see the plastic cartilage here. That's called the temporal. That's called the mandibular fossa. It's where the cartilage is, and these are called the mandibular condyles. They're covered with cartilage. So they allow your jaw to move up and down pretty properly, side to side. So that's the temporomandibular joint. So famous, if we look at the joints. Mandibular condyles. This is called the coronoid condyle. It's where that muscle coming from the temporal area helps move your jaw up and down. This is called the mandibular notch. When I'm holding the bowl where your teeth are at the bottom, that, or your teeth, I don't have to, on the bottom, is called the body. This, where it angles up, is called a ramus. A ramus is a wing portion. Where they meet together is the angle of the jaw here. That's important because it's an anatomical landmark. If you go back from it, you can easily palpate the carotid artery. So we use that if you're in CPR. I see somebody's pulse. Certain parts of external anatomy can stick out. And then on the inside, in the interior, you have a little opening called the mandibular frame. There's a nerve, one nerve on each side innervates the whole side of your lower jaw. So if you go to the dentist and use a local anesthetic on the lower jaw, I think he's going to give you a shot back here, and that whole side of the jaw basically goes. On the upper, there's no such luck. You have to do multiple shots. You ever have to have dental work to get older? Dread. Root canal, extraction. Boost. So that's most of the anatomy. The body, the ankle, the ramus, mandibular condyle, coronoid, tubercle, mandibular foramen, that's about it. Don't worry about the teeth. All the other bones, just a name. So you'll see it. There you can see the mandibular foramen, coronoid process. Here you can see the fossa on the temporal bone, the condyle itself, the ramus, the angle, the body. The maxillary bones are few, so I have a good model to show you most of the rest of these. I still don't know where it is in my diabetic one. The bone that kind of sticks around. But this is almost all the rest of the bones that are there. The largest are the maxillary bones. There are two of them, obviously, and they fuse once we're born. Some people are born with a cleft in there that is too far open. Okay? call that a cleft palate because the purple bone, and it's a misunderstanding, even though it's frequently associated with people who have mental disabilities, okay, limitations mentally. Not all, but sometimes it's just developmental. If they have, sometimes you can't tell. Okay, frequently the lip doesn't form, it's called a cleft lip or a ear lip. They typically have to be, those have to be repaired early because the baby can't suck effectively, and it's an opening that can lead to infection going to the brain. So it's something doctors are very aware of. So that forms what we call the hard palate, along with, in that sort of orangish color, there's an L-shaped bone this way and an L this way called the palatine bones. Interestingly, they are also a tiny part of those forms the back of your eye socket. So the facial bones, there's four, one on each side that participate in the eye socket or orbit. The maxillary, the palatine, the zygomatic, which I don't have, and I'll find it for you, sits over here, and these ones that are sort of in this mustardy color, the lacrimal ones on the inside of your eyes. The nasal bones do not. The bridge of your nose doesn't have anything to do with your orbit. It's close to it. So you have a pair of nasal bones, a pair of maxillary bones, a pair of zygomatic bones, the vomer, which sort of fits in here. I don't have one to show you. And the turbinates, which fit inside. I don't have one of those. They have to be here. These things are in yellow. Why they call it subacquatic, I don't know. I think it's part of the really, I don't make the rules. So I'll show you the rest of the slides and I'll take a break. And we got, so the maxillary bones, there's a lot of anatomy. I don't get crazy about it. I just know the name of the bone. Here it is. The one that you can see here. The zygomatic, which I don't have, you can see they have it in the blue color there. There's not a lot of anatomy, but it performs a really important part. So it's what we call the true cheekbone. And it helps to go back toward the temporal bone to make up that zygomatic arch you feel along the side. Okay, the nasal, bridge of the nose, lacrimal inside, you can easily feel that sac and fossa, the tear duct area. Palatine, I showed you before, they have a good, these guys here. One on this side, one. So this is called the hard palate under the maxilla, under the palatine bones. And that blue guy, which I don't have to show you, is the vomer. Those are the turbinates. So it's kind of, and this is a good way to show it. Here's that vomer, it's like a plow on the bottom. Here's the perpendicular plate from the ethmoid. The rest of your nose is cartilage. So this deep portion, if somebody has a broken nose and they operate, most times it's cartilage, but sometimes they have to straighten out the bone as well. And that's it. Let's take a break now and for 15 minutes or so and come back. So it's 2 o'clock now exactly. I'll see you at 2:15. And we'll try to do another hour or so and be done.